But the bacteria that survive are still the same species of bacteria, still tuberculosis, for example. So even the rare beneficial mutations we find do not really transform the organism. They make minor changes within existing species, which have never been controversial. And of course, the evidence for mutations has already suggested that to us. I can take a fruit fly embryo, and this has been done, in fact, and it can be mutated in every possible way, the DNA. And there are only 3 possible outcomes: a normal fruit fly, a defective fruit fly, or a dead fruit fly. That's it. You can't even change the species, much less get a horsefly or a horse or something like that. Well, we've certainly found a lot of evidence, but for what? Darwin's theory is that all living things are descended from a common ancestor, modified by unguided natural processes such as natural selection and variation. Darwin didn't write a book called How Existing Species Change Over Time. That's not even relevant. People have known that for centuries. So minor changes within existing species are not the issue here. And yet when Darwinists say there's overwhelming evidence for Darwin's theory, 90% of what they talk about is minor changes within existing species. That's not the point at all. The point is the origin of new species by this same process. And no one has ever observed the origin of a new species through variation and selection.
The scientific method must be observable and repeatable. So could you give me one piece of observable evidence for Darwinian evolution?
Okay, I would point to, as one great example is look at the genetics of the stickleback.
What's that?
So stickleback fish are a very interesting collection of species that were recently isolated after the end of the Ice Age.
What did they become?
They're various species of sticklebacks.
They stayed as fish.
Well, of course.
Could you give me an example of Darwinian evolution, not adaptation or speciation, but a change of kinds?
These are changes of kinds.
They're still fish.
They're distinctly different fish. For instance, I would say look at Lenski's experiments with bacteria then.
So what do the bacteria become?
The bacteria are still bacteria, of course.
So that's not Darwinian evolution. That's not a change of kinds, is it?
It is a change. It is a change in the genetic makeup of the bacteria, which
They're
is
still bacteria. So what do the bacteria become?
A new kind of bacterium.
So it's still bacteria. There's no change of kinds. To summarize, the observable evidence that you give me for Darwinian evolution is bacteria becoming bacteria.
No, it is bacteria acquiring new metabolic capabilities.
When you're talking about kinds or change in families, you're actually talking about macroevolution. You're talking about changes on the level that separate, say, cats from dogs.
So could you give me any examples of Darwinian evolution?
Well, when you say examples of that, then you have to sort of look at over a longer time frame.
When you say change of kinds, do you mean the evolution of one species from another or to another? Yes, we have that in action actually in the Galapagos.
Could you give me one instance?
Yes, we have an example from a group of birds called Darwin's finches.
What do the finches become?
They become genetically new and anatomically new, recognizably different species.
So they're still finches?
Well, of course they're still finches, yes.
So they're not a change of, there's no change of kind. Can you think of any observable evidence for Darwinian evolution, a change of kinds?
I haven't seen it myself, but I believe what the textbooks tell me about it, so.
You've got faith in the experts?
I have faith in the experts, yeah. I guess similar to how religious people have faith that God actually exists, I have faith in the experts knowing what they're talking about.
And I said to him, I said, listen, did you have a kind of a, maybe you just have a misunderstanding of what Christians are and what they believe. I said, listen, do you think Christians, we kind of just get together, everyone now and then, and we just sit in this big room, and somebody comes up to the front and they just open up this big book, and they start teaching under this big book, and everybody just believes what they say blindly. And he's like, yeah. And I was like, man, that kind of sounds like your science class.
I've been reading the Bible every day for more than 40 years. There's no mistakes in it, Mike. Any mistakes that we think are our mistakes. And you can trust God's word. I mean, think of how you trust professors and science books that tell you you're a primate. You trust and believe that. So how much more should you trust a God who cannot lie? Let me show you how fallible we are. Spell the word shop.
Shop?
Shop.
S-H-O-P.
What do you do when you come to a green light?
Stop.
Green light.
Oh.
So we're all fallible. We make mistakes. So imagine if you're making a mistake when you say this whole of creation came together because some explosion of nothing that produced everything, seasons, the birds, the trees, the flowers, the sun, the moon, the stars, and the marvels of the human bodies. Are you going to think about this?
Oh, yeah, no, I think about this quite a lot, believe me.
You know, the problem with those who are unable to see evolution, I think, is they don't have imaginations.
Evolution rests on faith. And once again, according to Richard Dawkins, faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Darwinian evolution requires great faith. The knowledge of God, however, is clearly seen by all mankind. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools.
Okay, we're back to Professor Johnson.
Professor Johnson, I think you do a good job proving that there's holes in evolutionary theory, questions that are still being asked, and dissent that's still happening among far-looking researchers. However, a lot of the researchers that you're probably citing have faith that the answers to these questions lie in the evolutionary theory in areas that Darwin may not have seen, but still see the answers as lying along that track. Why do your questions, why do the holes that you state go to prove any alternative evolutionary theory more than, how do they at all support creationism as opposed to a revisionist evolutionary theory?
She's asking you to fill in the blank of the mechanism of evolution.
Well, why should I even be interested in doing that? What you're asking is for me to join the other side and become a promoter of some half-baked naturalistic scenario for the history of life. Whereas my whole point is to tell you that these are half-baked scenarios and I don't believe any of them. See, this idea, you're supposed to promote a naturalistic alternative and be in our business, otherwise you have no standing. That's what keeps this system from crumbling of its own accord, is because of rules like that. And then it's promoted to the public as the creation story that everybody's supposed to believe and found their ethics on. Why should we?
But you state that there's a lack of empiricism in evolutionary theory, that there's some, there are questions left on, questions that still need to be answered and stuff like that, but you don't have any empirical evidence that creationism is true.
Yeah, well, what do we mean by creationism? There's loads of empirical evidence that there is, sure. Richard Dawkins begins his book, The Blind Watchmaker, the most vociferous argument for atheism in the guise of biology that you can find, by saying that biology is the study of extremely complicated things that look as if they were designed by a creator for a purpose. And in particularly, he goes on to concede that even a single cell contains genetic information that exceeds the information content of all the volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica put together, or a CD-ROM, or whatever you want to say. Now, then he says that's an illusion because we know that mutation and selection can do the whole job. But if you look at the evidence and you see how much that's just assumption and presumption, and it's downright against the evidence of the fossil record, and it isn't established anywhere, then you realize you're back to square one. In the words of Richard Dawkins, biology is the study of extremely complicated things that appear to have been designed by a creator for a purpose.
Would you like to?
As an undergraduate, I studied engineering, and I had very little interest in biology, was much more interested in the physical sciences. It was really as a graduate student that I started for the first time to really take an interest in biology. And the reason was, for the first time I was exposed to the molecular details of biology. And it was in the molecular details that I saw the kinds of things that I loved in the physical sciences, in chemistry and physics, and the things that I loved in engineering. So I remember being in a lecture at Caltech, and the professor was explaining a remarkable control circuit that works at the molecular level for controlling. It's how the cells control production of one of the 20 amino acids, tryptophan. So it's called the tryptophan operon. It's this suite of genes that make tryptophan, and they're elegantly switched on or off in accordance with the demands of the cell for tryptophan. And he was explaining how this works, and there's just a very clever way that the cell switches these suite of genes on if it needs tryptophan and off if it's got enough tryptophan. And I remember sitting there having, an engineer's perspective and thinking, I studied control systems theory at Berkeley and have some appreciation for how important it is and how hard it is to keep chemical processes in control. And here I'm seeing something that works at the molecular level, where you have a feedback loop that achieves this kind of control at the molecular level. And I was blown away. I had never seen biology like this before, and I was very intrigued by it. And I was also, it seemed obvious to me that I was looking at the product of engineering, and remarkable engineering at the molecular scale. It also occurred to me that while things like this were being given a Darwinian explanation, I did not find that at all compelling. And I also thought that this is something that potentially someone could investigate in a clear and compelling way as to whether this could have evolved or not. My suspicion is that right now, I think probably a lot of young biologists who are not career Darwinists are looking at what is coming out of intelligent design and are impressed with it. I know this to be the case because we meet with a lot of young, very bright scientists. And I suspect that what's going to happen is Darwinism is going to lose the next generation of biologists. And as that generation moves into the more powerful, influential positions in the scientific community, that's when the change will occur. It will, basically, Darwinism will retire by the Darwinists retiring, and the new generation is not going to accept Darwinism. That would be my prediction. I strongly suspect that young biologists right now, say students, undergraduate or graduate students, are much more open to intelligent design than their professors are. And whether that's sufficiently dominant that in 20 years we will see a wholesale abandonment of Darwinism or not is hard to say. But I definitely expect there to be this progressive erosion as we move from generation to generation of the Darwinian idea, because it just does not hold water. It doesn't stack up. And it's the young people who are the most open-minded about this because they're smart. It's not that their professors are smarter than they are. It's that the people who have been doing science from a Darwinian perspective for 30 years have a hard time laying that aside because they have a lot at stake. Whereas if you're, a young person, you don't have so much at stake, so you're much more free to look at the evidence and go where the evidence leads.